this segment of Ask Dr. Ron, the question from a producer really centered around, is it worthwhile putting on nitrogen to stockpile forage for later season grazing? And so I've asked Dr. Keith Johnson to join me, the forage extension specialist in agronomy, to kind of help me work through that. Hey, Keith, let's start at the very beginning of this. You know, right now we're sitting in mid-August roughly. Pastures are growing. You know, if we're in a rotational grazing system, you know, cattle have been in a pasture, then they move to another pasture, and so forth. So let's talk about what are the ideal cells to be able to add nitrogen to, okay, so that we can get the maximum forage production and utilization out of our land.
Well, in terms of the use of stockpiling, I would suggest that probably somewhere around 20 to 25% of the acres that are in that rotational stocking program as part of the cells that we have would be an appropriate number of acres to think about getting the task accomplished.
So would you use kind of the cells that maybe I grazed in early August, you know, mid-August? Okay, are those the prime candidates that I just moved out my cows out of onto another cell? Is that the cell that would be probably the most benefited by nitrogen?
Most definitely. I think you're looking at the time that you move the animals on to the next cell, that it's time to think about getting that fertilizer on so that we take full advantage of the time that we have to grow as much forage as possible. If you think about cool season grass growth and development, we really have two phases that we're really growing forage, and that would be in the early spring to mid-spring, late spring. Then we get into this dormancy time that we're kind of still a bit in. But as we move into September and into October, we definitely have an opportunity to grow more cool season forage growth. And so we want to make sure that we have ample amount of nitrogen in place such that we can take full advantage of those weeks to grow the forage.
Timing on that nitrogen fertilizer to be most cost effective?
I think we should be looking at by September 1 to be most cost effective. Of course, to make this work, we not only need the right temperature, I'm less concerned about that, but we need moisture. So that's one of the risk factors. If we're talking about forward forecast saying, well, we're going to be way below average in moisture in September, well, then maybe that isn't the year to think about doing this. But if it's an average to above average type of rainfall situation and we get it on by the first of September, I think it could be a real go.
What form of nitrogen would you use?
I think the right form probably is urea. It'll be cost effective. The downside of urea is if you do put it on a hot type of hay day where we have a situation where it's dry soil, it could be a situation that we have volatilization, so we don't get the full amount of nitrogen. On the other hand, if we can time that such that there's a likelihood of rain in the forecast over the course of a few days after application, that would be most ideal.
What kind of rate are you talking? What's your research and your experience tell you on how much nitrogen to put on?
Well, I think you have to look back. What have I applied this year? And if you've applied anywhere less than 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and I think most Indiana producers probably have, but if the grass is showing that there is a need, in other words, if it's not deep green emerald and it's still growing well, maybe you don't need to be thinking about the application of that nitrogen. On the other hand, if it's moderate in color, growth needs to be spurred on a little bit, then I think you think about investing in about 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which then would translate to around 100 pounds of urea per acre.
So would you kind of wait until maybe it rains in the forecast if we're kind of coming through a dry, warm stretch, you know, have the fertilizer buggy ready to go and apply it at that point?
Absolutely. If we can see the rains in the forecast, try to be as timely as you can with that application. That would be the ideal time to do it.
What about, you know, we always talk about using legumes in our pastures, okay? And so, you know, if we've got clover, for example, in a fescue stand or whatever, do I need to put on fall nitrogen?
I would say if you have on average scattered about roughly 25 to 30% legume and it's relatively uniform, keep in mind that the legume does provide some nitrogen back to that grass for growth. And as a result, I would say that is not the place when you have that amount of legume or greater in the pasture. We want to be at a lesser than, say, 20% legume to think about use of that nitrogen to grow cool season grass.
Any estimate on, okay, if I put 50 pounds of nitrogen on in a typical year, what would that do to my forage yield?
In terms of forage yield, as compared to nothing,
Yeah.
I would say probably you're taking it from somewhere around 1.5 to 2 tons of dry matter production per year, and boosting that probably to 3 tons or more.
Okay. So it's worth considering.
Absolutely.
Particularly on a predominantly grass pasture.
Right. Now, one thing I would also say in terms of efficiency, if you have need for phosphorus or potassium, and that's been dictated by soil test, blend the nitrogen along with the phosphorus and potassium. This is the right time of year to be getting those type of nutrients supplied.
Keith, thank you so much for joining me. You've helped answer the question.